The Reverend William Howard Jr. is pastor of Newark's Bethany Baptist Church and internationally known as a religious and human rights leader. A graduate of Morehouse College and the Princeton Theological Seminary, he's a former president of the National Council of Churches and served 8 years as president of the New York Theological Seminary. He was appointed to the Rutgers University Board of Governors in 2004 and has served as chair since 2007. Rutgers launched significant redevelopment projects under his leadership, including campus improvements, classroom renovations, new academic and research facilities. Reverend William Howard Jr., chair of the Board of Governors, was awarded an honorary Doctor of Humane Letters degree from Rutgers University. Reverend Howard, I want to thank you for hosting us today. It's a delight to be here, and I have to say I'm quite excited to be interviewing you today. I haven't been able to interact with folks who have been much of a part of history and witnessed history as much as you have, so I want to thank you for having us today.
Thank you for coming.
I think the best thing to do is just jump right in. I think one of the things our viewers might want to know about is your childhood in Georgia. We know in 1961 that you were involved with voter registration in Georgia. So can you talk a little bit what that was like for you as part of a segregated South in terms of trying to get folks registered to vote?
Well, in those days, of course, as you say, Georgia, I was in southwest Georgia, which is very near the border of Alabama. Mm-hmm. And if it was segregated anywhere, it was segregated there.
Okay.
And keep in mind that in many of the counties in the so-called Black Belt South, mm-hmm. blacks were actually the majority of the population. Mm-hmm. So for African Americans to become actively involved in voting mm-hmm. Implied a change in the political landscape. So there was quite a resistance to voter registration. As American as that is, mm-hmm. You know, there was quite a strong reaction, sometimes violent reaction, to the effort to get citizens registered. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, there's such a long custom of black people not having the right or not assuming the right. Mm-hmm. Getting people to register or even persuading them that they had a right to register right. Was a part of our task as well.
Well, let's talk about that for a little bit. We're in the South in 1961 where literally folks were, you know, harassed, if not physically, mm-hmm. you know, preyed upon in some ways in terms of the conversations, and trying to convince folks to vote, to be able to have the right to change landscape and be able to have say in their own place in terms of their senators, their Congress folks, their council people. Mm-hmm. Kind of what conversations happened? How did you convince folks to come out to vote and to register to vote?
Well, it was in the midst of a certain climate of that time. Mm-hmm. Perhaps you're not old enough to have been a part of that time, but I'll say that there was a kind of what Dr. King used to call the zeitgeist. Okay. There was a sense that this was a pregnant moment, that the age-old traditions of segregation, Jim Crow, were being tested to the limit. Mm-hmm. And so people were more inclined to take risk. Not to say that people weren't anxious or afraid, but mm-hmm.
they
weren't crippled by the fear. And of course, they supported young people, and young people were in the vanguard of this, demanding a better shake. And of course, voter registration was paired with concern for open accommodations. Right. There were so many things, like public libraries, for example, that were simply not open to us. And the voter registration went hand in glove along with some of these other things.
In terms of from then, meaning 1961, till today, we obviously see some change, and we have a long way to go in lots of different ways. Mm-hmm. From your perspective, what are some of the challenges that still face some of the African American community and the black community when it comes to being involved with voting and getting folks out to the polls to be able part of the American perspective?
Well, I think the kernel challenge of this country is finding ways to include marginalized workers. Mm-hmm. include them into the economy. I think economic issues are the pressing issues of our time, and they affect everyone, especially the working class of every race. Right. This was a part of the landscape in segregated Georgia. There were many whites in Georgia who were economically insecure. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, they exercised their insecurity by expressing hatred toward black people, right, rather than finding some common cause. And we have a challenge now in the post-industrial age to rebuild, to reinvent the American economy so that the broad masses of people in our country, whatever race, can help feed their families. Mm-hmm. Everybody's got to eat, you see. Right. And when there's a question about whether you're going to eat or I'm going to eat, it produces a kind of artificial conflict between us. Right. So I think that's the great challenge. Okay. We didn't have an economic analysis in the days of voter registration. Mm-hmm. The economy never really changed. The people who were wealthy then are still wealthy now, even if we're voting. So the lack of participation, for example, in places like Newark, where yesterday we had a school board race, we had a poor showing among the voters. I think this is related to a lack of a sense of confidence that voting will make a material difference.
Correct. And from my perspective, as somebody who witnessed the 2000 elections for presidential mm-hmm. elections, mm-hmm. do you think that had a major impact in terms of people question now whether their vote counts from the 2000s, and then as they went through and they've now seen the election of Barack Obama as president and mm-hmm. lots of other changes, mm-hmm. I think that folks are still questioning parts of the government, whether my vote counts, kind of what's happening. So we kind of went from the 2000s of questions, excitement over Barack Obama's election, and now questions again about whether votes really count.
Well, I think that question is raised in different ways depending on the level of political contests. I think that it's not across the board the same perception in every election. Okay. So that you see people voting for Barack Obama because they heard the voice of change, they heard the tenor of change. Mm-hmm. And by the way, the resistance that we see in the country today is a sign that there is change underway. Mm-hmm. It may not be the change that the far left would advocate, mm-hmm. you see, right. but it is just enough to shake things up and actually lead people who stand to benefit from some of this change, fearing the change. Okay. Because change is only change. It's not content. We need to know what the change's content will be mm-hmm. before we have a sense of comfort and normalcy again.
One of the great changes that you were witness to, one of the great changes that you were involved with, was the release of Nelson Mandela out of South Africa. You were denied visas into South Africa before his release, and then you were permitted to come into South Africa to kind of work in South Africa with some of the issues that were happening. Can you give us a little sense of what you were doing in South Africa mm-hmm. and how South Africa kind of dealt with those changes and that content while you were working there?
Well, you're right to say that I was denied visas. So for literally 15 years, I received repeated invitations, mostly by the churches, mm-hmm. to come to South Africa, and I was unable to go. Okay. So clearly most of whatever I did regarding South Africa was done outside the country. All right. So in 1990, though, the year that Mandela was fully released, he was released in December mm-hmm. Of the prior year, I was able to go twice, both times in a delegation of persons, okay. And both times the only member of the delegation held back, even with a visa. Oh, wow. But what did I do after Mandela was released? I'm not sure very much. I, for example, refused to go to observe the elections. You remember there were yes. quite a few people going there. I wasn't sure the South Africans needed me to observe their elections, so I didn't go to that. But before the many years from, say, 75 up to 90, I was involved in raising money for liberation movements in Southern Africa, but not just Southern Africa, in the Portuguese colonies, Guinea-Bissau, Angola, Mozambique.
Okay.
We were involved in supporting oppressed racial minorities all over the world, including, for example, the Koreans in Japan.
Okay.
We supported the Algerians in France, for example. But South Africa responded in a peculiar way to this, and I was a part of something called the Program to Combat Racism of the World Council of Churches.
Okay.
Persona non grata in South Africa. I was also chair of something called the United Nations Conference on Bank Lending to South Africa, which involved mobilizing countries in Western Europe with major banks, and also countries in North America, meaning mainly US and Canada, the banks in those countries, developing a coalition of resistance against further bank lending to South Africa.
So it was monetary in terms of being able to lend, being able to work with them in terms of loans, being able to work with them in terms of being able to support what they were doing. Was it connected also to the World Bank in terms of the conversations?
The World Bank was not present there,
Okay.
but the aggregate institutions were obviously key to the World Bank's capacity. And of course, being involved in the effort to isolate economically, in general, the South African regime. In the state of New Jersey, for example, participated in the decision by the state government to divest its holdings from companies doing business in South Africa.
Okay.
Invited by Governor Kane to participate in his signing of the divestment bill. So my involvement was international, but I also live in New Jersey, so I was a participant locally as well.
So you said when you visited finally after the 90s and you had gone to South Africa that you were held back as one of the members of the delegation. Can you kind of explain the rationale for being held back, or what was the conversation?
They never told me. I mean,
okay.
Even when they denied me visas, they didn't say because. In fact, this is a Kafkaesque way that they explained it. They would say, "Dear Mr. Howard, your application for a visa to the Republic of South Africa has been unsuccessful."
Okay, so there was
and I have a scrapbook, you know, with these visas, but they were never forthcoming. Even at the airport, at customs, when they would hold me back, they wouldn't say very much. They would just sit in a little booth looking at a computer, and after protestations from my peers just across the gate, eventually they said, "Mr. Howard, you may go." Always with respect, but it's evident that they were reviewing some kind of record.
And it was clear to you that they were reviewing those records and making it clear to you about your involvement in some part internationally. Another major international event that you were involved in was the IranContra scandal. I mean, the Iran hostage scandal.
Yes.
And that you were one of the few folks who was able to meet with the Iran hostages in the 80s to be able to provide counsel. Can you tell me a little bit about that historic event and kind of what you experienced during that time?
Yeah, that was 1979. The hostages had been taken that year in November, and the three of us from the United States, Bishop Thomas Gumbleton of the Roman Catholic Church, he's the auxiliary bishop in Detroit, I think, and Dr. William Sloan Coffin, who at that time was pastor, he's now deceased, was pastor of the Riverside Church in New York. The three of us went as Americans, and in Paris we were joined by Cardinal Etienne Duval, who had been a priest or maybe a bishop in Algeria, and he was quite respected in the Arab world. And the four of us journeyed together. We were the first to see the Americans being held hostage in Iran. And we conducted pretty traditional Christmas services, but we were able to report their well-being, their parent well-being, and to bring messages to their families, and to some extent diffuse for a moment the environment that we were in.
Okay.
The kind of jingoistic tendencies, you know, bomb the bastards,
Right.
that type of thing. But it was a pastoral mission, not in any way political, and you know, it was a very meaningful kind of entree into a world that was speculated about. So, for example, when I came back, I was able to tell then President Jimmy Carter that the students, for example, were not Marxists.
Okay.
If you go back and review the tapes in those days, they referred to the students as Marxist revolutionaries, but they were very devout Muslims, Shiite Muslims.
Watching the news at that particular point, you're correct. There was a lot of American animosity. There was also this strange countdown for how many days it had been held, and this large conversation politically on, you know, 60 Minutes as well as other magazines about what did this mean.
The birth of Nightline.
It absolutely
Ted Koppel came into being in the American mind over the Iranian hostage crisis.
But what you had talked about in terms of having this pastoral perspective with them and being able to meet with the hostages is very different from the news coverage that I remember. It was very, very hostile, and it was very, very conflict-oriented in terms of the conversations. Can you talk a little bit about your time with them? And you know, you talked about it as a Christmas mass, but what was the conversation like? You said they were doing well, but you know, it seems so.
They were also, for example, they had no sense of what was going on here. They were in complete isolation of all of this. And just to be able to say that their families were concerned about them, the nation was behind them, all of this was a kind of morale booster.
It gave them hope.
For them. And I mean, we talked about everything from faith to the playoffs, you know. I don't know if it was football. I think we were in the middle of a football
season. Yeah, it would have been
playoff or something like that. So they were interested in, you know, Super Bowl contention. Some of them wanted us to take direct messages back to their families. We were allowed to do that. So it was really a care, pastoral support kind of thing. And we were invited to meet the Ayatollah Khomeini, and we actually left the country so that we would not have to directly decline his invitation.
Okay.
That was one way we avoided the sort of political circus that was going on in that period.
I find it interesting that you talk with Jimmy Carter, because Jimmy Carter is also a Southern Georgia boy. In
8 miles from my hometown.
So talk to me a little bit about that interaction. How you know, here you are in the midst of what some would be his major crisis at the end of his presidency, and you know, there were lots of conversations about was he doing enough at that time to release the hostages. But here you are, two Southern men, two Georgia men, who are 8 miles away from each other in terms of growing up and being in that. Can you talk a little bit about that interaction that the two of you had, and kind of what was that like?
Well, he was very interested in what we saw. He was interested in sort of a personal account. I mean, how were the people doing? He didn't talk to us. He didn't talk to me. I met with him one-on-one. He didn't talk with me about, let's say, the issues surrounding the hostage crisis, the takeover, the Iran-American issues, the Shah. I mean, that was all out there. He wanted to know things like the nature of the student orientation, the welfare of the hostages. He was very appreciative. He spoke, you know, very appreciatively about our having gone there, you know, at some risk. And he did not know I was from America, so of course he wanted to talk about back home a little bit. And subsequent to that, we talked on a number of occasions, sometimes not about Iran, but the most substantive conversations I had in that period was with Cyrus Vance, who was then the Secretary of State, and of course the intelligence people wanted to debrief us, which you know we certainly obliged. But I would say that Secretary Vance, who I knew a little beforehand, and he was actually a relative of one of the people who traveled with us, was more engaged in asking about details like where in the compound? Were we actually, we couldn't tell them, because once we entered the gate, we were blindfolded and taken to the various places where we went.
Wow. So that means you had a lot of trust in the people who were taking you there then, too.
Well, not really. I mean, it wasn't a matter of trust. I mean, you went for the purpose of visiting the hostages, and the way you got to see the hostages was you had to abide by their protocol. But because they invited us, we presumed that they were operating in good faith.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead 20 years. One of the major changes that you were involved in was right here in the city of Newark. You came to the city of Newark and came to Bethany in 2000, right around the time of the election of between Sharp James and Cory Booker. It was a big time in terms of political change in the city of Newark, and also a lot of issues to deal with. Economic development issues, violence issues, conversations of development around the river, development in terms of what did it mean to knock down projects here. I mean, there was a lot of discussion going on in the city of Newark. You were the chair of the transition board for Cory Booker. Can you talk to me about what Newark has been through in the past 10 years? And as a church leader and as a community leader, what has that really meant for you, and how has that really influenced your congregation and even your approach?
Well, let me just say that the change going on in Newark has been going on since the Second World War.
Okay.
I mean, we see different manifestations of this now. Newark is still in crisis because the fundamental cause of poverty in Newark, which is the underlying truth of Newark, all of the pathologies that have developed, drug trade, violence, whatever, poor performance in schools, the floor of this is economic poverty.
Right.
Because the manufacturing base that built Newark doesn't exist in America anymore.
Right.
To say nothing of it's not existing in Newark, which also explains Camden and a few other places, right?
Camden, Detroit.
Don't forget our capital city, Trenton.
Yeah.
So when the work disappeared, that's when Newark's problems began. And all of the elected officials, leading right up to Cory Booker, has had a better idea about how to tackle the problems of Newark without an economic analysis and any strategy for changing this. New Jersey is essentially presumed wrongly that it could have great cities, I mean a great state without great cities.
Correct.
We've abandoned what used to be engines of revenue for the state because of their, manufacturing base and job creation. So, I came into Newark where another phase of this change was going on. I've seen a lot of building, which began under Sharp James. By the way, I was here when Cory ran first and lost.
And then ran again, right?
And then he ran again. But I think there had been a fair amount of, housing renewal, the implosion of failed high-rise apartments, even under Sharp James. This was quite underway before he left office. And Cory has continued that to some extent, except he's been hit by a recession for a good bit of his term. And I suspect, because Cory is a great ambassador for this city, there's no question. Newark's reality has been for a long time a little different from the image of Newark. But he has sort of improved the image of Newark to people who are outside of Newark, which is important because we need new investors. We need new ingredients to job creation, and I think Cory has been good for that.
One of the things I want to touch upon, because I think you're absolutely correct, as somebody who...
And I'm hopeful that when the recession recedes, we will see an uptick in new development and the like. And we've seen a little hint of that with the new hotel and various other things.
One of the things I want to talk about is this image of Newark. As somebody who worked here for 13 years within the city has a lot to offer. Sure. And most folks are completely unaware of what it has to offer. And I think you're correct, folks have this image of a very violent city and a very disparate city in lots of different ways.
Right.
Can you talk to our viewers a little bit about what Newark has to offer and kind of just give it our viewers a little different taste of Newark, because I don't think you're correct. I think that the vision of Newark doesn't match the real Newark in terms of kind of what's here.
And we do have deficits. It's not because the people are innately violent or uninformed or whatever. I mean, we have a basic structural economic crisis in Newark, but Newark has enormous assets that can be employed to overcome this, not the least of which is the port, right. And then add the railways and other kinds of economic assets. And I think there is a cadre of people in Newark who see that and are moving to address these issues. But it is an exploding art scene in Newark, for example. Most people don't know that. It is a destination for cuisine of a certain kind. When I was in New York for almost 30 years, I met people who spoke Portuguese, who would travel here from Mozambique or from Lisbon or wherever, and on Friday night they were headed to Newark. Right. And I would say, well, what's going on over there? And they would tell me. Now I've come to Newark, I've seen. You have the universities here. And you have a cadre of young people who are gathering in Newark. If you know a little about the Halsey Street corridor.
It's changed a great deal.
That's taking on a hint of sort of a mini Greenwich Village.
Yep.
And the people of Newark are vibrant. I mean, even those who are struggling. I mean, I call it the wish they were working class. They are civically engaged in ways that don't always manifest itself in conventional ways. So I have found being in Newark one of the most exhilarating periods of my life. And let me say that when I came to Newark, my good friends from across the way wanted to send the men with the white coats to check on me. That's how twisted the understanding of what this place is.
In 30 seconds, we have 30 seconds left. You're the outgoing chair of the Board of Governors for Rutgers. What's the one thing that you want Rutgers to do in the next 5 to 10 years that you've been working towards as the chair?
You're wonderful to ask me that. I think one of the great achievements of Rutgers in New Brunswick has been the consolidation of the undergraduate programs. I think there are very few people there in New Brunswick now, and if you were around then, you know it was very controversial, who would question the value of that. Now, Rutgers needs to help us to understand how the 3 campuses are operating to serve a unitary mission. Okay. In the same way that New Brunswick was consolidated, we must now have one university operating in 3 places.
It's a great way to leave that. I want to thank you for joining us today, and again, thanks for hosting us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.